I'd like you to turn your Bibles tonight to 1 Timothy chapter number 6. 1 Timothy chapter 6. I don't know if as you were a student in school, maybe there were some subjects that stood out to you that you really enjoyed. I always enjoyed recess and lunch. Those were my favorite subjects. Ironically, I always enjoyed science. I thought science was a pretty neat field of study, and there was a lot to me that was just always quite intriguing about that. History I couldn't stand, didn't make any sense to me. I wish I had paid more attention in history. Would have helped my Bible study a whole lot more, but literature and English, those things were just terrible, and so I taught English instead. But anyway, one of the rather famous individual, perhaps you've heard of him, made a rather important discovery. A man by the name of Nicholas Copernicus came to the realization that the sun is stationary and that the earth actually revolves around the sun. Say, what in the world does that have to do with this message in 1 Timothy chapter number 6? It's my opinion that there are many people in this world who think that the world revolves around them. Years ago, science proved that is not the case. And it's amazing what you see. You find people who sometimes have unreasonable demands, and they expect you to answer to them in absolutely every single capacity. I'm amazed at society today to see, you expect children to be going through the process of learning no. But I'm going to say it's a really sad thing when a 50-year-old throws a temper tantrum because they've been told no. But that's the society that we live in today. And it's really very tragic. It's a shame that people have gone throughout their entire life without this realization that the world actually does not revolve around them. Sometimes when it comes to the matter of possessions, the amount of things that someone thinks that they have means that now they are above everybody else. Ever met someone like that? You aren't worthy to walk in their house. That's fine. I'd rather not. Okay? You see how that mindset is. We will invite everyone else. Well, we're not, please, you should just stay off. I'll tell you what, some churches have even developed this mindset towards bus children. What a shame. Oh, no, we'll just put the bus kids over there because, they might damage the carpet or they might damage the walls. There's a thing called sheetrock, mud, and paint. It does a lot. Okay? The point in time where we begin to value our possessions to that extreme, we've come to a wrong point. We have allowed something that God has blessed us with to now become a hindrance to us in our own spiritual life. Those who have done so will all of a sudden discover that the reality is often much different than something they wish that it were. Well, we move into 1 Timothy chapter number 6. In our previous message, we've looked at here in this section false teachers, and we've presented and contrasted them. We've already seen a couple of things. We've seen the presence of false teachers. Last time we noted also as the command of Timothy, and then last time we began this section with a contrast of the godly. We noted in verse number 6 that godliness with contentment is great gain. Our focus after establishing some biblical guidelines pertaining to money, we then looked at the presence of, or the essence rather, of three different terms: godliness, contentment, and great gain. And knowing the dangers of money and the dangers of material possessions, the Word of God is filled with a tremendous amount of instruction about those matters. Unfortunately, there are many Christians who have unknowingly allowed money and material possessions to deceive them into a false sense of security and happiness. They look at the paycheck that they are bringing in and they think, wow, I've got it made. Very similar to the rich man who said, I've got all of this, what shall I do? Well, I'll tear down my barns and I'll build greater. And that night it was said to him, thou fool, this night thy soul shall be required of thee. That was something he didn't anticipate. It leads to a false sense of security, and unfortunately it often leads to a false sense of happiness. There are many Christians who are absolutely convinced that if they were able to just get that one more thing, they would be happy. They are some of the most miserable people on this earth, especially when they do not get what they want. And this comes back to this reality that Nicholas Copernicus came across that said, you know what? The sun is stationary. The earth revolves around the sun. The world does not revolve around these individuals. And when they don't get their way, they're mad. What's that mean? It means they're mad. Okay? They've got a wrong perspective on stuff. And oftentimes that perspective is because they are deriving their happiness, their joy, their security, their meaning in life apart from God. Okay? And you see that in how they react when they don't get what they want. It's interesting to me to hear the differences in child rearing. I hear many different opinions on a school bus now, and you ask a student to do something, and the question is, why? And that question is repeatedly, why? At times, that question goes on for 30, 45 minutes, why? Let me ask you something, those of you growing up. What would have happened if you had said why for 45 minutes to your parents? We probably shouldn't answer that question, but I think we could all at least agree on this. Was not going to happen, okay? My children did not get that opportunity to just argue and argue and argue. What's the problem? The problem is where we're looking for our happiness, we're looking for the satisfaction. And if I can sit here, I'll be happy. If I can purchase this, I'll be happy. If I can have this relationship, I'll be happy. That's not it. And that's what we centered on last time. Godliness with contentment is great gain. And so we saw in verse 6 that the godly are characterized by contentment. We want to begin tonight, verses 7 and 8, and we want to take a note at this point. The godly maintain biblical values. We'll pick up the reading again in verse 6 just to get the context, and we'll read down through verse 10, though we're not going to cover all of that. Paul writes to Timothy and he says, "But godliness with contentment is great gain." And he explains why he states that. "For we brought nothing into this world, and it is certain we can carry nothing out. And having food and raiment, let us be therewith content. But they that will be rich fall into temptation and a snare, and into many foolish and hurtful lusts, which drown men in destruction and perdition. For the love of money is the root of all evil, which while some coveted after, they have erred from the faith and pierced themselves through with many sorrows." That word "for" in the beginning of verse 7 tells us that he's still developing this principle that he established in verse number 6, and what he is doing is he's giving us an explanation. So we learn then that the godly are going to maintain biblical values. First of all, we note that nothing we acquire is permanent. Paul says that we brought nothing into this world. A person who is born into this world enters, as we all know, with absolutely nothing. Now here we're not speaking of the world as the organized system. 1 John 2:15, for example, love not the world. Here we're speaking of the habitation of humanity. So a child is born into humanity, and he enters the habitation of mankind with absolutely nothing, not a stitch of clothes on him. What a rude awakening to life. That little guy or gal was so snuggled and so warm and so comfortable, and all of a sudden the temperature drastically changed. Okay? Circumstances all of a sudden changed, and here comes a life into that world, and that child has absolutely nothing. Do you know that that is a reality that is a universal truth? This has always continued, and it's always going to continue for all time. This is a reality, a universal truth that spans generations. It even spans geography. This isn't one of those, back when I was a kid, I was born with. No. They all were born the same way. It doesn't matter whether you're born in the most sophisticated hospital in the United States, if you are born on the backside of a jungle, it does not matter. These are universal truths that have always been characteristic, always will be. They span geography and they span generations. And there is something else that is equally certain, he says, and it is certain we can carry nothing out. The word certain would suggest this is something that is clearly understood. I think we know this, that this reality is no person is capable, he does not possess the ability to take something out of this world when he departs from it. Do you know that is as equally a universal truth as the baby born into this world with nothing? Once again, it is a reality that has always been true and always will remain true. It is true for all people, regardless of a generation, regardless of a geographical location, and regardless of the accumulated wealth or social status they perhaps achieved in life. We might say everyone is born the same way, and the results of death are always going to be the same. We understand they're going to go one way or the other as far as eternity, but this reality that they carry nothing out is something that is certain. Now, there are not too many certainties in life. It was Benjamin Franklin, I believe, who said that death and taxes are the only two things that are certain. And there's certainly some truth to that. And if you think that taxes are going to be done away with, good luck, okay? That's not going to happen. But there are not a whole lot of certainties in life. Even some of the most secure jobs can be lost. People can build a retirement and get right to the point of retiring, and that's the point when some of these corporations will actually cut them, and they do so intentionally. What a shame. But there aren't too many certainties in life, but we can be certain of this, that no person possesses the capacity or the ability to take something out when he dies. We know this is a truth. It is clearly evident. Why is it then that so many live as though they possess the ability to carry something out at death? In order to gain a biblical perspective on the nature of possessions, we have to understand that nothing we acquire is permanent. Everything that we get is transient. It's temporary. It's going to pass. When we were born into this habitation of humanity, we entered with nothing. When we are taken in death, no individual has the ability to carry things out beyond the grave. I want to look at a couple of passages that are going to illustrate this as well. Let's turn to Ecclesiastes chapter number 2, and we'll begin in this passage. Here's a man by the name of Solomon, the wisest man who ever lived, and I believe he's the focus here. Some disagree, but I don't find any compelling reasons to think differently. But here is Solomon who ventures on into a life without God, trying to find meaning and purpose without him, and incidentally, he failed. Ecclesiastes chapter 2, I want you to notice verse number 18, because Solomon looked at this reality that you're not going to be able to take it with you when you die, and he concluded, this is vain. Verse 18 of Ecclesiastes 2, the Bible says, "Yea, I hated all my labor which I had taken under the sun." Why? "Because I should leave it unto the man that shall be after me." Interesting. Called an inheritance. You ever seen families get divided over the inheritance? It happens all the time. And you know, once they die, they can't control anything. Someone recently, and I don't remember where I heard it, read it, I don't know, somewhere. And I read a lot and different things. But anyway, someone alluded to the idea of spend it now while you can. And basically, you determine how it's going to give it away while you can now, before you actually die. And then it's been settled. But it's kind of an interesting idea. I'm not here to give estate council currently, but anyway, at least as an idea. But here was Solomon who realized, you know what, I did all of this, I worked hard for all of this, and I'm just going to leave it. Why am I going to leave it? Because I can't take it with me. I'm just going to leave it for someone else. Well, let's go ahead to a couple of chapters, Ecclesiastes chapter number 5. And he alludes to this again. Ecclesiastes chapter 5, notice verse 13. There is a sore evil which I have seen under the sun, namely, riches kept for the owners thereof to their hurt. But those riches perish by evil travail, and he begetteth a son. And there is nothing in his hand. Notice verse 15. As he came forth out of his mother's womb, naked shall he return to go as he came, and shall take nothing of his labor which he may carry away in his hand. And this also is a sore evil, that in all points as he came, so shall he go. And what profit hath he that hath labored for the wind? You worked hard for what? Now, this is a perspective of life apart from God. Okay? There's no meaning in it, and Solomon came to this realization because the reality is, I'm not going to be able to carry this out with me. Interestingly, Job also recognized that everything we acquire in this earth is transient. You don't need to turn to it. I think that we recall it. Job expressed a similar reality. Job said that when everything was taken away from the Lord, naked came I out of my mother's womb, and naked shall I return. The Lord giveth, and the Lord taketh. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Isn't it interesting that both Job and Solomon express this reality that material possessions are transient, but the mindset between the two was vastly different? Solomon regarded them as an empty pursuit of a life lived apart from God, and it had no value. Job viewed it as blessings from God that resulted from a life lived for God. Therefore, Job could look at these things with a biblical perspective. Solomon says these are an object to pursue, and became very disillusioned because what he learned is there was no lasting contentment or joy. Job, on the other hand, said, these are things that God gave me. These are things that God has blessed me with, and because his focus was not on those things when God took them from him, it did not alter his mindset towards them. These were instead blessings from God that God intended for Job to enjoy. We learn a couple of principles about this. The location of our treasure, number one, indicates the location of our heart. Jesus alluded to this in Matthew 6, a passage we've studied a little bit more extensively recently. We referenced it again on Sunday night in our series on the life of Esau and his selling of the birthright. But in Matthew chapter 6, Jesus admonishes believers to not labor for those things that are on this earth, where moth and rust doth corrupt, and where thieves break through and steal. Don't lay up treasures there. But instead, he says, lay up treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust doth corrupt, and where thieves do not break through and steal. And then he makes this statement in verse 21. Where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. The location of your treasure indicates the location of our heart. Number two, the location of our heart determines the nature of our pursuits. Where your heart is what you're going to pursue. Let's phrase it a little bit differently. Those who value material possessions highly will inevitably devote their time, their energy, and all of their resources to the pursuit of those things. In fact, they'll probably have to work themselves to such a degree they won't even be able to enjoy it. The cost of vehicles is getting unbelievable. I was recently speaking with an individual just carrying on light conversation about pickup trucks. Luxury pickup trucks are now over $100,000. A four-door, half-ton truck is about $70,000. That's a lot of money. You're going to work a lot. That truck's going to sit in a parking lot while you work a whole lot of hours. Okay? Hopefully it's really comfortable, because that's probably where you're going to sleep. Okay? I mean, that's insane. Okay? Look at, in our world today, the devotion that people have towards things. They're pursuing them like crazy. But on the other hand, those who value eternal reward will highly devote their time, their energy, and their resources in the pursuit of that. Which one do you want? Do you want something that is going to produce eternal reward, or do you wish for something that is going to be temporal at its best? Paul obviously says, and Jesus would clearly echo this in Matthew 6, Paul clearly in many other passages, but in addition to 1 Timothy 6, we should devote all of our time to pursue that which is eternal. This is what we are called to do. Why? Because we all know we can't carry anything out. So then why do we live as though we can? You see, this isn't just a knowledge that's to be theoretical only. This reality that we all know to be true is intended on making an impact on how we choose to live day in and day out. It's not going to go with you. We see not only that nothing we acquire is permanent, but number two, the essence of one's life is not defined by possessions. He says in verse 8, "And having food and raiment, let us be therewith content." Now, we talked last time that contentment is an inward disposition that is at rest with one's present circumstances. It's a definition I've come up with, and I don't think you're going to find it anywhere else. I didn't intentionally copy it, so if someone else has it, that's great. We both think alike. It's an inward disposition. It's a mindset inwardly, and it is at rest with one's present circumstances. I find a lot of Christians who think they are content, and they are anything but content. Okay? Because the moment you ruffle their feathers, they show it. Okay? It's like the infamous cat that you grab a hold of and just run your hand backwards up its fur. Okay? I like to do this to one of my daughters. Take her eyebrows and go backwards on them. Oh, it drives her nuts, okay? And I say, well, why would you do that? Just because it annoys, okay? And now Jill's wanting to scratch her eyebrows. Okay, it's just thinking about it. But anyway, you look at this. Joan just did the same thing. You look at these things and say, okay, well, all of a sudden, this is how we look sometimes for essence. The essence of life is not defined by possessions. A person who is truly satisfied with his present circumstances will reflect his contentment in several ways. He'll reflect in his demeanor. He's not going to be negative in his disposition. And he's also going to reflect it in his pursuits. Paul says we should be satisfied with food and raiment. These are the basic necessities of life. Food, obviously, is that which is going to sustain the body. The term raiment simply means covering. It may mean just clothing, though it may also, and I would tend to think that it could be legitimately expanded to include that of a shelter. You need to be protected from the elements, okay? There's not too much more. Would you be content with only those things? You see, the essence of life is not defined by our possessions. Jesus stated in Luke 12, verse 15, "Take heed and beware of covetousness." And this is then the following statement. "For a man's life consisteth not in the abundance of the things which he possesseth." The world values possessions. They use those things as a means by which to define success. A person who is living in an affluent neighborhood is a successful person in these people's eyes. Those who drive certain vehicles or those who have certain homes, these are successful businessmen or ladies. That's how the world defines them. Have you ever noted God's assessment is much different than man's? God's assessment and man's assessment of the meaning and purpose of life is very different. Number one, we learn from this that the presence of possessions does not produce contentment. We've already established this. Solomon found this out. Solomon said, I'm going to give my heart to all of these things, and I acquired all of this. We can read earlier in Ecclesiastes, I believe it's chapter 2, where he got all these things and found out it didn't produce happiness. An individual who is engaged in a wholehearted pursuit of material possessions will soon discover they do not produce contentment. They're incapable of doing it. We know that to be true, but I want you to notice point number 2. If A is true, and I believe that it is, that the presence of possessions does not produce contentment, I think you can also conclude number 2, that the absence of possessions does not necessitate discontentment. How many times have you and I as Christians thought, if only we had such and such? If only we had a better job. If only I had an easier deck of cards dealt to me, so to speak, for life. If only I had things that worked. If only I had like everyone else has. You see, the absence of possessions does not necessitate discontentment. In fact, what you'll discover is that God oftentimes allows difficulties as well as prosperous times to learn the necessity of contentment. Paul stated in Philippians 4, not that I speak in respect of want, for I have learned in whatsoever state I am, therewith to be content. And then he goes on and he says, I know both how to be abased and I know how to abound. Everywhere and in all things I am instructed both to be full and to be hungry, both to abound and to suffer need. Number 3. Difficulties teach the true source of contentment by refining our concept of a need. You know, I often define needs differently than God does. I've had this problem even growing up. I remember as a child there were things I needed. And I would use that word. I need this. I need this toy. I need this candy. I need this gum. I need this whatever. I need this. God has a much different assessment of what I need. Incidentally, God's assessment's always right. And you know what God does? He allows difficulties to refine our concept of what a need truly is. I've heard many Christians claim Philippians 4:19, my God shall supply all your need according to his riches and glory by Christ Jesus, as though it is a blanket statement for all Christians. I'm just going to say it's not. Now, the Christian who puts God first and gives as God leads, and that's the context of Philippians 4:19, will discover God's promise of provision. The Christian who is stingy is going to learn God's got a way of getting it out of you. Okay? He might turn you upside down and shake it out. All right? He's got a way of getting your attention, and he's got a way of getting you to look to him. And all of us in here have experienced those moments where it was, okay, Lord, you win. Okay, those are good things for us, and we shouldn't have ever had to go to that point. But God uses these hardships to refine this concept of a need, because it's at that point in time that we really find out what is truly important. A person who endures an unexpected loss soon discovers the reality of what's important and what's needful. I've always been amazed by the statement in Luke chapter number 10 and verse 42 when Jesus told Martha, who was overly stressed and frustrated, that Mary was not doing her part in preparing the meal. He says to Martha that you're careful and troubled about many things, but before that it says, Mary, there is one thing that is needful. One thing that is needful. And Mary hath chosen that part which shall not be taken away from her. I have a hard time defining my life to saying one thing is necessary. We need to get God's value system. Number 4, contentment is a learned process that stems from a properly defined value system. Paul said in Philippians chapter 4, I have learned in whatsoever state I am therewith to be content. It's a learning process. And what a process it is. We go through hardships and we go through difficulties. But if we have a skewed value system, we will never discover contentment. It's not going to be found in material possessions, but it will be found in an understanding of the sufficiency of God. Here's how the writer of Hebrews phrased it. Let your conversation be without covetousness. Let me just say it this way. Stop wanting more. And be content with such things as ye have. Not as you want to have, but as you presently have. And here's the reason, here's the basis. For he hath said, I will never leave thee, nor forsake thee. Your sufficiency is found in God. It's not found in possessions. And the person who learns contentment will experience the reality of Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 5. That all I need is God. That's it. That's the person who'll be content with food and raiment. Because it doesn't matter. It's all temporal anyway. Now, that doesn't mean we're not good stewards, obviously, of what God's given us. But God expects us to be content. And while it might be an obvious statement, I'm thankful that the expectation of contentment establishes the possibility of contentment. You know, God doesn't ask you to do something that's impossible. You're not being instructed here to be content, and that's just a wishful theory out there. No, it's something that's possible. Is it easy? Probably not, depending, especially if you're extremely discontent. You're going to discover how difficult it is. And if we choose to live in our own strength, then we'll find out that it's virtually impossible. But when we submit ourselves to the work of the Holy Spirit, we'll soon discover that God enables us to do what he has commanded us to do. So the idea that he commands us to be content says that I can be content. I just need to have my focus where it needs to be. After all, Nicholas Copernicus learned a long time ago, the world doesn't revolve around, or the sun doesn't revolve around the world. People today need to learn that same principle. Life does not revolve around them. It still revolves around the sun. And you could say S-O-N in that particular case. It's an interesting lesson for us all to learn. Lord,